Hello, I think we're ready. This is the October Finance Committee meeting of the School Board of Upper Dublin School District, and I'm going to call to order the meeting and get right into things. Do we have any announcements, Mr. Leckman?
There are no announcements.
Okay, we have meetings from our September 19th, minutes from our September 19th meeting. If you have any comments or questions to that, please let Brooke know so she can send it on to the legislative meeting. We're going to jump right into our recommendations. We have the third borrowing for Sandy Run project. We talked about this last month with Jamie Doyle. I'll let you.
Sure, and really this, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here. Jamie went through this all last month. The only thing we didn't move forward last month, and we agreed that we would wait till this month, was to authorize moving forward. So nothing has changed from our discussion last month. This is just the action that now the board needs to take to move forward with that third borrowing. So that's what we'd be looking to move forward to the board meeting for Monday night.
Does anyone have any comments or questions on this? We did talk about it. Do you have any questions? No? Okay, if that's the case, then we'll move it forward. We have our standard motion that's here. Next, we have the treasurer's reports.
Yep. So for the treasurer's report this month, you'll see the general fund. We have received to date 72% of budgeted revenues, which is very much in line with the prior year. Real estate taxes are back in line with prior year. If you remember last month, we talked about we were seeing about $5 million less than we were in prior year. And where that actually came into was the timing of the end of the discount period. So August 31st is the end of the discount period. That was actually on a weekend this year. So until all that money actually flows, you'll be surprised how much comes in right at the end of that discount period. There was about $5 million that were deposited in the early part of the month. So that was really just a timing of deposit issue. So we're all good there. And then expenditures year to date are right in line with prior year at 15%. So everything's trending right where we would expect to see it this year. On the investment side, again, I won't go through in detail, but the investment side is looking fine. We have $4.5 million invested in short-term CD products in Pliget accounts, and $60.5 million invested in products with PISLAF that allow us for weekly access to that cash flow. School districts tend to keep most investments short-term. We get the vast majority of our money up till August. So we get the money up till August, and then we spend it down throughout the year. So most of our money is in very liquid investments. Interest rates, I'm not sure if anyone's paying attention to the Fed. So interest rates are, depends which side of the fence you're on, but there's people talking both sides, but it looks like it's probably a likely that we'll see another quarter-point reduction in interest rates when the Fed next meets. So we'll see what happens there. We'll see what happens going forward. I think it should stabilize after that point. But again, I said this last meeting, I'll say it again, that's good and bad for school, for entities. We lose money on the investment income side, but as we are borrowing money for Sandy Run, lower interest rates are obviously beneficial to us. So good and bad news there. And then food service, again, nothing notable to go through there, but you have July and August food service reports, and those will should be approved at the board meeting on Monday night.
Any comments or questions on
I have
this,
one.
Joan?
So you're talking about having most things invested. So is the 2019 bond fund only in cash? Is there a reason for that?
So it's not necessarily in cash. The bond funds are in it's almost like a PISLAF account with Pliget. So it's actually, we're earning 1.8% interest on that. So we really only have about $8 million. I think on the report it's a little over $9 million, but right now it's down closer to $8 million. That money is going to disappear like that right now. So we need to keep that very liquid because it's going to go down. And also with the next $10 million we borrow, that we're going to go through that in a relatively short order. We'll have a much more defined investment plan for the larger borrowing that we do in 2021.
Any other questions, comments?
Just the $60 million in the PLISLAF, is that very liquid? Is that basically liquid?
It's in an investment product that we have access to weekly. So we're earning about 1.8% on that, so it's still a very good rate when you look at
It
what
is.
savings rates are right now. So it's a CD investment product, but we have pretty much full liquidity, full access to those funds.
Okay. Well, if there aren't any other questions, we'll move this forward then for the meeting on Monday. And we're gone on to C, the fund balance review.
Yeah, so fund balance review, I wrote a memo on this, which is attached to the item. But where we're at, every year, per our fund balance policy, we are required to do a review of our current fund balances as of the end of the year. And as we talked about last month, we completed our audit of the 2018-2019 financials very successfully. So where we're at right now, the last two pieces of data that we're required to provide to our auditors is fund balance and what we're planning on doing with our fund balances. So as you know, we have committed fund balances for both healthcare stabilization and for real estate property assessment appeals. So what we need to tell our auditors is if we plan on making any additional commitments to either of those accounts. So what I did was I went through and put together a summary in that memo of where things are trending right now, what our fund balances are looking like, what the percentages are, and then our recommendation as part of that. So if you look at that memo, as of the close of 2018-19, you can see what our current fund balances are. So in the real estate assessments, it's still a little over $960,000. Health stabilization fund, we have $2.16 million, and that would be again for health stabilization. Health benefit stabilization is health benefits are very they trend up, they trend down, they can vary widely from year to year. So that would be if we ever have any large increases, we would be able to stabilize that with maybe a lower increase one year and then another lower increase the next year and fill in the gap with some of this fund balance. We have an assigned fund balance of $3,270,000, and that assigned fund balance is what we use to balance our budget from year to year. So that's the gap between revenues and expenses for the current year's budget, the 2019-2020 budget. So our non-spendable, which is prepaid, is a little over $100,000. So our total committed fund balance is just shy of $6.5 million. And our total unassigned fund balance is $3,268,000. Our fund balance policy says that we want to keep our unassigned portion of our fund balance between 5% and 8%. So you can see that as a percentage of expenses, we're a little below that right now. It's currently 3.2%. But what I also added in here, and again, I think you've seen this in trends from the past, is the budget tends to be a bit conservative. So the $3.2 million that we have as assigned fund balances is probably never going to be all used when we close this year out. So if you add both of those together, we're actually at 6.3%, which is right in the middle. It's not great. It's not too bad. So it looks good right now. But with that said, because we're only at 3.2%, which is below what our policy sort of guides us to, it's not a hard and fast rule, but it guides us to be between 5% and 8%. I wouldn't be recommending making any additional commitments this year into either of those fund balances. And further on the health stabilization fund, I broke that out below on the bottom of this memo here. Not only do we have a committed fund balance of a little over $2.1 million, but in our healthcare consortium that we're part of, we also have a balance of funds that are there available to us to cover, any expenses or to stabilize rates there as well, of about $1.178 million. So the total available to us in health stabilization is $3,338,000. Our monthly billed premium is $775,000 per month. So that means we have about 4.3 months of funds available to us to stabilize healthcare. We've tried to pin our healthcare folks down to say what's the right amount, and while they'll never give us you should have this, the answer is regularly between 3 and 6 months. what you should have available to monthly premiums. So I feel like we're in a good spot with both of those committed fund balances. So my recommendation, like I said, this year would be to leave those committed fund balances where they're at.
Can you refresh my memory? When do we get a first look at our health insurance?
December, we should
December,
get a
okay.
first look, and there's 3 looks that you get. I believe it's December, February, and then you get the final in March. Yep.
Any comments or questions on this? Joan?
So I know our policies are things that we think are important, but they're also based on state law. So the things that are state law, we really don't want to change because we need to follow state law. So I guess that, I guess I'm asking which parts of this are state law? Is the 8% maximum the one that we really don't have discretion over, and the 5% is something that we think, in terms of good financial management, is best practice?
Yeah, so state law, I don't know that there's state law that defines either of those percentages. The number of 8% really is a school district's ability to increase taxes on an annual basis. So if your unassigned fund balance is beyond 8%, then you're not legally allowed to raise taxes within a year. 5 to 8%, I think, so 5% is a guideline that says, we believe as a school board that's the right amount of fund balance we want to have available to us in an unassigned manner, what we need to cover truly unplanned for expenses that you need. And that's why I think we start to line other funds up, because yes, it's smart to have a committed fund balance for healthcare, because healthcare is, it trends all over the place. It's smart to have money for reassessments because we're dealing with so much of that right now. Even though the economy's been strong, we're still seeing a lot of commercial assessment appeals.
There are some districts with significant fund balance at the end of the year, but what they end up doing is moving it all from uncommitted to assigned or committed.
They'll commit it
Or assign.
or move it to a capital reserve account,
Right.
which is also very prudent, and that's something that Mr. Lesser and I will spend some time this year is going through a 5-year capital plan and start to look at how much money we should have available in a capital reserve fund, because our buildings, and you heard some of that in the operations committee tonight, our buildings are going to need work over the next 2, 5, 10, 20 years, and we need to start setting money aside to make sure we can cover that.
Just to answer Joan's question, in the policy committee, I really pushed for that 5% minimum number, and we use the 8%, as Andy says, because that comes out of the Act 1 regulations. But the 5% was something we chose to put in and ran it through the finance committee to make sure that the finance committee agreed, just as a matter of prudent financial management.
Any other comments or questions? Okay, I think then there's nothing to move forward on that item. We'll move to the budget development process update.
Yep, so this is just a minor item. I just like to keep the committee in the loop on where we're at in the budget development process, so there's not a ton of items to go through tonight related to the budget, but where we're at right now, and I included a memo that I put out to the entire leadership team. So last week, I had the opportunity to meet with our leaders across the district, our budget owners, and talk about the budget development process for this year, and that memo was sort of what we looked at. And really the key that I think I've addressed with this board, and I've certainly talked to our leadership team about it, is we are really going to break down the budget process this year. And I know Dr. Yanni has done a great job of lining everyone up and sort of having this conversation last year and developing a true budget that is based on needs. Right, so every single person that's responsible for a budget, and we assigned everybody a line item from our budget. Everybody was assigned something, and they'll take ownership of their building department budgets. They'll build a budget that's truly based on need within their buildings. What do our teachers need to teach our kids? What do our kids need, to learn and get the most out of their education? what do they truly need, and to break that down. And part of the goal is for the folks who own the budgets, the folks in the buildings and departments, are to have some of those tough conversations in their buildings, and then come and meet with our central office cabinet team and present their budgets to us for discussion. And what'll happen is, we will then take that information, roll it up, make some recommendations, and then starting really at we'll have some discussion next month, but really at the December meeting, we'll take a good detailed look at where the budget is trending. And then, as we discussed with the timeline last month, what the board will need to determine then at that point is, do we want to approve a preliminary budget, or does the board want to approve an opt-out resolution which says, hey, we're going to stay within the Act 1 index, which is 2.6% for next year. So that's kind of where we're at in the process. Over the next month, all of our building and department budget owners will put together their detailed first pass of the budget, and then we'll review it the week of November 18th. We'll have meetings to discuss that internally. So that's kind of where we are with the budget process.
Any comments or questions? Amy?
One of the things that we've been talking about a bit over the last year in terms of the development of the strategic plan and now your arrival and this process, at some point down the road, are we able to tie together those two concepts or documents in some way, just to kind of demonstrate how we're aligning the budgets? I don't know if there's even a way to do that, but I think it would be valuable to the public to see that work happening in some way, if possible.
Yeah, I'm certain we can pull that together. I mean, our financial goals and the position that we're taking financially should align. I mean, your financial goals should support your entire strategic plan that you have, right? I mean, that it needs to sit underneath and support it. So they should be one and the same. Absolutely. We can figure out how to do that.
Any other questions? Okay, there's nothing to move forward on that at this time. We'll move on to the 5-year projection model assumptions.
Yeah, so this is a document the board has reviewed, at least going back, as I go back through documents, has reviewed on an annual basis. And again, I don't know that there's a need to go through this in a ton of detail tonight, but I wanted to get this out in front of you as we start to build next year's budget. And primarily when we roll out the first draft of the budget, one of my, part of my philosophy of managing the financials of an organization is not just looking at next year, it's looking at next year and the next 4 years. So we should really be looking at 5 years worth of information to understand how what we're doing now, how that impacts us in 2, 3, 5 years. So I wanted to just kind of give you an overview of what we're looking at right now as we build out this portion of the budget and as we look out multiple years. So you understand when we start to bring this to you, where some of the numbers are coming from. And primarily on the staffing and benefits, where we start out. So we start out with status quo on staffing and benefits. So really, it's too early to start to look out and say, what's our enrollment going to be next year? We can certainly look at trends, but I don't know that we've seen, at least in my short time here, any major shifts in trends of enrollment. So right now, we're looking at status quo for next year's budget and as we look out into the future. The 308 to 800 accounts are really the work that our principals and department heads are doing. So as you scroll down through this document, I think, in the past there was some inflationary number in there. I'm starting out with that number being 0 across the board because, and I think it's for the point that I mentioned already, is that we know, and rightly so, school districts do this because the state sort of forces you to do this. We have a conservative budget. I mean, let's just be honest so we're all on the same page. We have a conservative budget, so there's really no need to take all of these line items and start applying inflation factors to them because that's just going to make your out in the future, look even more off than what it might already be because we're using a conservative model in our budgeting approach. And the reason, just so it's clear, the reason that we use a conservative approach is because once you set that dollar amount for expenses, if you say our expense budget is $100 million, you are not allowed to spend beyond that. So the state, caps you at $100 million and you may not spend beyond that. So school districts when I say forced to take a conservative approach, that's why. We must be conservative on the expense side and then manage it as tightly as we possibly can. So that's why we've typically come in, and I think you'll see school districts in general come in better than what their budget plan says. We have commitments of rate stabilization and assessment, and we talked about that, so there's no plan to increase or use those funds in any of our budget models. And we typically have a budgetary reserve of $250,000, which I've used in the past, and I believe it is smart financial management to have that in your budget. The Sandy Run Middle School assumptions, this is, and we talked a little bit about this last month when Jamie Doyle was here, but these increases are based on the model that Jamie reviewed with us last month. So if we borrow how we have planned out in our financing plan for Sandy Run, these would be the major increases over the next 2 years. So in 2021, because we're taking only the 10 million bank qualified this year, we would have about a $540,000 impact in 2021 and a $1.8 million impact in 21-22. Knowing that Jamie's numbers are conservative, and I think, you know, some folks even asked that at the last meeting, and Jamie said, yep, we're conservative in the interest rates that we're using, so it should, you know, it should be better than that. On the revenue side, local, and again, I'll cover this further in more detail when we get into the budget details, but our assessment, when you look at the total assessed value of properties, has been relatively unchanged for the last 5 years. So we're seeing a lot of positives, you know, growth, new building, people doing work on their homes, and then we're seeing the offset on assessment appeals, commercial properties appealing their assessments. So everything we gain, you know, we give right back through an appeal. So there's really no assessment growth to factor in. We'll look at new developments. Certainly we'll do some of that work, but we talked about this last meeting. I'm not comfortable building that revenue in, especially since we've seen it given right back in the past. So as it comes to us, we'll build it in. The Act 1 index, right now we're using 2.6 as the placeholder and 2% out into the future. We can decide if we want to use those numbers, use less numbers, you know, lower numbers, but that's what will be built in. And the IFO put out an estimate last year where they looked out and said 2021, 2.8% for the Act 1 index to 3.3 to 3.4%. So they see, based on the strength of the economy, the Act 1 index increasing over time. But again, their estimate was 2.8 for this year, and it's only 2.6. And then some of the other ones, there were a lot of increases on revenue line items in the 1920 budget. So, you know, we did see some budgetary increases. So we're not really looking, at least in the preliminary portion of the budget, to make any large changes on the revenue side. I'm not one to push the boundaries on revenue and come in short. I'd rather, you know, be conservative, especially since we already made some increases in the current year's budget. Investment income is, you know, I think 750,000 is a good number, but if interest rates continue to trend down, that might be something we need to look to decrease. And then earned income does continue to trend up, so we're looking at 1% increases each year. And then other sources are hold flat for now, but we'll look at trends. The state budget, really, you never know what's coming each year, especially since the basic ed funding and the special education funding are built on formulas now. You know, there is some hold harmless there, meaning, you know, we get what we've received in the past on basic ed funding. Special ed funding is all driven out on the formula now. So that's how our special ed population is changing in relation to all school districts across the state. So you really have no idea how to forecast these numbers. The good thing is the state's been giving us a little more money every year, but really that just kind of fills in PSERS, you know, the increase on the PSERS side. Transportation, we do see a real decrease there, and that's something I've started conversations with Mr. Robbins about. So we've had a budget of $500,000. Last year we only received $400,000 of revenue. So that's something we're looking at to figure out, you know, what that decrease is due to. So we'll look into that a little further, but right now the budget reflects where we were at this year of $400,000 in the transportation subsidy. And then the federal line items will be held flat, at least for preliminarily and out as we look into the futures. On the expenditure side, salaries are going to be based on contracts. So, you know, we look at as many years of the contracts are done, and that's what we have built into our budget for next year. and our trends out into the future. And again, I mentioned all staffing levels will be held at current levels. On the benefits side, we do, our benefits consortium uses an 8% trend, so that's what I tend to build into our budget this year and out into the future. So as we get better information, we would obviously revise this, like the 2021 budget projection. Out into the future, I would tend to leave 8% as the trend factor. PSERS, we do every December. PSERS puts out the certified rate for next year's budget, and they put out a new forecast. So those are what's available to us now, and we'll update that when the new one comes out. All of the details down below, as I mentioned, that's the work we're going to do this year. So really, we're going to hold that at 0% for next year's budget, except where we know we need to make some changes. But the trend out into the future will really be zero until we start to look at some of those trends through the budget process. And then the only other thing I want to mention is the transfer. So just so everyone's, right now we've made transfers in the past to the capital reserve fund and to the debt service fund. In this year's 1920 budget, we have a little over 1.4 million budgeted to transfer into the capital reserve. Out into the future, we'll have no money budgeted to transfer. So as we're looking at deficits that we need to work on in our budget process, we'll refine that. Some of the methodologies I've used in the past at New Hope when I was there was you can wait till the end of the year, pass a motion that says, hey, if there's any surplus in the actual results at the end of the year, you can transfer up to that surplus rather than just budgeting an amount and transferring that mid-year. So there's other things we can do. There's methodologies we can use and talk about, but at least in next year's budget, the preliminary run of it and future projections, there will be a $0 to transfer, at least as we build it out. Okay, and the plan, obviously, we talked about the millage rate, but it does not include any additional millage that we could get. We'd be available to increase taxes to for PSERS and for special education. We will report that to the board. So that's one of the numbers we would give to the board as we talk about tax increases, so we could make an educated decision, so you understand the number, but there's no increases built into the plan for those amounts. So I said a lot. I'll stop there and ask if there's
Okay.
any questions.
Are there any questions? Yeah. Okay. Go ahead, Mark. Oh, go ahead, Joan.
Doesn't matter. Are you using different forecasting software or tools than we've used in the past? Do you intend to do something a little bit differently than was done in the past?
So I have my own model that I've used. We also are in the process of implementing a new software called Scenario, which was purchased before my time, but it's through PFM, and it's something I've seen and am very, very impressed with. So we're transitioning out of Excel, which is, I love Excel, but Excel has great limitations, especially as you start looking at 5-year models, making changes on the fly, running scenarios. So we're going to use that model. I would say my model is probably slightly different than what's been used. Again, when I look at the 300 to 800 accounts, I'm not just plugging in a CPI. I'm holding some of that steady. So I would say it's slightly different than what you've seen in the past.
There was also, I think, another software, and I'm not sure if I'm confusing it with another use that I believe Ms. Bray used, Forecast 5 or something like that. Are we transitioning away from that?
Actually, a newer product. The Scenario is the more updated version from PFM. So, and it's much more powerful, and it's web-based. So when you're making changes, it's pretty instant that you can see the results. And it's a lot more powerful. And I think the slides are they're more simplified. So I think they're easier to understand when you make changes to the numbers. So that's what we've been on the phone, I think 3 weeks now, training with them and going through all the slides and having them show us what it can do.
That PFM forecast, whatever it was, we would always see out, it was always a 3 to 5 year projections that we would see. So whatever's new, we'll see that again.
It's,
And it'll
yeah,
be probably more
it's-
accurate?
it's about the same, but it's more powerful. There's more that you can do with it. And it's to replace the one we were doing before, but it's still through PFM.
So when do you think we'll do that exercise, Andy?
Yeah, so some of that discussion would start in December. When we roll out the preliminary version of the budget is where we would start to look out a couple of years and look at some of that new information. On accurate, I would just, and this is why I preface this by saying, if you start with a conservative budget as you look out and, as you look out years, it's going to be conservative. So, you do need to factor some of that in. But, it's as accurate as the information as we have available to us. If you get out beyond 2 years, I mean, we're doing our best guess. It's helpful from my standpoint in decision-making, so you can look at how expenses are trending away from revenues, because we are seeing that, but
What I always had a concern was, Jennifer would know, whenever we would see looking out long-term, we were always in the red long-term. But then when we got to those years, it seems to adjust. We weren't in the red. So hopefully this tool will maybe give us a better picture.
So the only thing I would say to that is, as I've said a couple times, is we're starting from $3.2 million, right? That's our gap between revenues and expenses. So
Right.
yes, I would agree that's conservative, but that's our starting place.
Okay, Mark, you want to?
The 300 to 800 accounts, what percentage of the budget is that? You knew I was gonna ask that, you should have known I was.
So there's a whole level of detail there that we'll get into when we do the presentations, but I think about 80% of our budget is salary and benefits, which would leave about, debt then would add another 10% on, so maybe 10% of our budget.
Any other
That's where we
comments or
have the
questions?
flexibility in 10% of our budget, basically.
Well, that's why I say that not necessarily, and we'll get into some of that, right? Because within that 10%, you have
Fixed.
contracts, you have utilities, there's
Right.
all kinds of stuff in there. There's IU costs for special education, there's charter school costs, so when you really
So you
carve it all
really-
down, there's much less than
Less
that
that we
is
can,
truly discretionary.
my point.
After that, good news. Any other comments or questions on this? No, that's okay. Okay, then we're down to our last item, the food service bid award.
Yes, and again, this is just a minor item. So Kristen Deli, who is our food service director, she is requesting the award of the food service bid for bread and for milk. So she participates with a group of school districts, and they purchase as a consortium. Every year, one district takes the lead on the bid documents and having the board approve it. So Kristen had the pleasure of being the lead this year, so this board has the pleasure of approving this bid this year. So it's as simple as that. And then I think she said 9 districts will be part of the milk bid, and 12 districts are part of the bread bid. So they all work together to make sure they're getting the best prices, even in food service. So
Any questions or comments on that? I guess, go ahead, Stan.
Yeah, do we bid these out last year? I know you weren't here, but
Different district did it, yeah.
Kristen would have been part of this bid, but another district would have approved it. So they sort of rotate who owns approving these bids each year.
If everyone is okay with that, we'll move it forward for the Monday meeting. We are now up to community input. If you would like to address the committee, you may do so at the podium.
Did I make it? Okay, just a couple questions under the contracts, under expenditures. First, on the salary increases for teachers for the next 3 years, are you able to give me a rough idea of what that is in terms of new money, meaning money on top of what was already in the steps in the chart. So in other words, the 3.25%, is that equal to $1.5 million of new money or some, just rough? The salary increases for Act 93, you have in here 3% for 2021 in all projection years. I just wanted to clarify, that is voted on by the board yearly, right? So it doesn't, there's no reason it has to be locked in at 3%. Am I correct on that, or is there some kind of change? In other words, if a board wants to make it 2.5% increases, they vote on that every year. It's not a 3 or 4 year contract. For Act 93 is for administrators, right? So I just wanted to clarify that certainly could be changed. And I guess I'm not, without looking at it, I'm certainly not recommending it's changed, but what I would always like to see, and I love to see, and I know this is very preliminary and this was great tonight, and I'm really glad I came. I'm sure other people are thrilled too. But on this note, I would love to see as a taxpayer, so how do we compare? I would love to see comparative data on just about everything. And we used to have a lot more comparative data before, and you're great, so don't think I'm making a comparison, but I'm old school here. And when we had Wade Coleman, who's now at Wissahickon, he brought comparative data for everything. But that was, there was a board that wanted comparative data. So my point is, it might be nice for the community, or I could put in a right to know, but I don't even know if you have the comparative data. Be nice to see, maybe the top 15 administrators, or even if you wanted to do just the top 10, how do we compare to what we're paying compared to Wissahickon, Springfield, Happer, Horsham, whatever. It's just always good to see that. I've been asking, and I know Dr. Yanni, you're kind of working on it. I just wanted to throw it out here again. I'm always curious about the per pupil expenses, and again, first I'll start with Upper Dublin. What are our per pupil expenses? But if we can get how we compare to similar districts, and I know I have old data at home, and I just kind of want to compare to where we used to be and where we are now on that one. Let's see if there was one more thing. Oh, I was really glad to hear you say, Mr. Leckman, not glad to hear you say that the money that's coming in, like from new developments, is going right back out. Wasn't happy to hear that, but I really love this, and I wrote it down, that you're not comfortable building in new revenue until we get it. Yes, thank you. I think it's just the way most people handle their household budget, unless you like living with a lot of risk, and most people do not. Because I think there's been a lot of a trend here of first of all, there's been pushing for developments that people are not always happy about if they happen to live near them. But to always be planning that we can do this and we can spend this because we're going to get that money, you don't ever know what money you're getting until you get it. And if what we're already getting, let's say from the Toll Brothers over 55, if that money is already going right back out, then it's not a good strategy to plan on spending it, because obviously we don't have it. So I'm just pointing out that's a real major change from what I've observed at other budget meetings in the past. Thanks.
Jen Kuznets, Fort Washington. Just to follow up on the per pupil spending, if we do that, can we break down how it's broken down? Because I know, teacher salary is one thing, and then interest is another large. I think that's our second largest expenditure, and then curriculum. So it might look like we're spending more per pupil than a lot of other students, but a lot of that is going to interest on debt. So if we can just get a breakdown of that, if you are going to go down that road. Thank you.
Are there any more comments for community input? Okay, there being none, we'll close community input. Do we have some answers here on some of the questions? I don't know if we...
So related to the question about Act 93, so the Act 93 salaries are approved every year or the increases are. The reason we use 3% is just for a projection. There's nothing to say that the overall increase will be 3% that's just there I'm sorry? Oh, there as a placeholder, as a projection. So last year, I believe the average increase was, or the overall increase was like 2.1%. So, and that will fluctuate based upon the number of administrators we have and their salary ranges. Ms. Kitten, Ashley Kitten, our Director of Human Resources, because right now we're looking to negotiate a new Act 93 agreement, as the current one expires at the end of June, has looked at every district in Montgomery County using the salary survey that they put out, and we have the low, the middle, and the high point, so that we can look to see if we are, number one, offering competitive salaries, but also if folks are on the high end of a band, then the conversation we're having with folks is that, you know, when we look at peer districts and we look at like positions, you're paid really well, so the increases you're going to be getting will be much smaller. And folks that are in the lower end of the range, we have to do some salary correction there. And that work will continue over the next couple of weeks as Ashley puts the rest of that data together.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add then on the teacher salary increases, I mean, I'm happy to share some of that data. I mean, that's some of the data I will present, when we start talking about budget information, is some of that line items and the increases that we're seeing and trends that we're seeing. So that's certainly information that I would expect to be sharing over time.
Like the new money question.
The new money question,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Some of the comparative data, I mean, that's something I'll have to look into. Again, we don't necessarily have that readily available.
Or per pupil?
Or the per pupil expenses, how that's broken down. So we can look into some of that, but.
Okay. Are there any other comments or questions then from anyone? Mark?
I'm just surprised by the comment that not counting new revenue until we have it seems like a new thing. That seems very much like an old thing to me. I remember Brenda saying it, every time we discuss new development, that's me. I'm just a little bit bewildered by that comment. And I think a lot of these things, like comparing administrator salaries across districts and looking at the bands, is also not new. I mean, I know it has to be done continuously. That's something that we've been doing for years.
Dan?
Andrew, can you comment on how fast or how much special education and special needs kids' costs have gone up in this district? And also, does those costs also average into the per student cost? I mean, from what I understand, some of these a special needs kid could cost $170,000 a year to have that child come into the classroom.
So I don't know that I'm prepared to talk about that tonight, but that's certainly a data point that we would have available to us to talk about trends, special education costs, but they're trending up not just here in Upper Dublin, they're trending up across the state. I mean, the cost of special education, and yes, even if, you could have one student that costs $100,000+ that either is here or, may move in. So it's definitely it's a budget issue that many folks across the state are dealing with. And, those students require the services. I mean, they have a need for the services, but they're extremely expensive in some cases. So that's a data point I don't have tonight, but we will share that when we start talking budget.
But I think to that point, though, as we're building the budget like has been done, we will be looking at the trends. So, when we look at Michelle Clegg's budget for pupil services, for example, which encompasses special education, we'll actually look at, or continue to look at, what has been budgeted and what has been actually spent. And then of all the budgets in a school district that comprise the annual budget, the pupil services special education budget can be the most volatile, just because there's so many unknowns. And here in the district, we're committed to not only meeting the needs of kids, but really making sure that they have successful experiences here. And so it's I always feel like for directors of pupil services and special education directors, it's always the most difficult budget to put together, just because there are so many variables that are just absolutely unknown until they manifest themselves.
I was just going to add, the Education Law Center recently came out with a publication that listed costs of special education, the increase over a 10-year period, the amount of increase at the state level, and the amount of increase at the local level for every district. So that's something that is also available.
I think part of what has led to increased costs of special education in school districts, as school districts have gotten much better at meeting the needs of kids, and maybe when you look 5 or 10 or 15 years ago, we weren't, districts as a whole, when I say we, I don't mean Upper Dublin, I mean as a whole, we're not necessarily providing the level of services that we're currently providing. We believe very firmly here that students should be educated in their home schools here in our district, unless we absolutely cannot program for them. So, when I started my career, what we provided in special education looked very different than what we provide for today.
Any other comments, questions? No? Seeing none, I will say that the next Finance Committee meeting will be Thursday, November 21st, after operations, and we are hereby adjourned.